there is a more or less clear understanding what is Ukrainian victory tactically, meaning restoring Ukrainian territorial integrity, punishing the perpetrator. But what can be done in order for this victory to be sustainable? And here, what is lacking in this discussion? There are two issues without which there will be no Ukrainian victory. First one is Ukrainian full membership in NATO, and second one is change in Russia or in post-Russia, if Russia fully collapses. And here, there is definitely, firstly, a lack of vision, and secondly, lack of action in this matter.
Why are you saying so? Because what you're saying actually means that even if Ukraine regains its territory, there will be a second war and a third war, etc., because Russia will
Absolutely.
try to take the revanche. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. The question is how to make Ukraine's independence irreversible. And for the moment, without the strategic security framework, it does not seem to be possible. It will be just a postponing of further solution, increasing the cost and prolonging the tragedy.
If I tell you that there is a possibility of Ukrainian victory without regaining fully our territories, for example, as Finland did, we can say in the Winter War, would you agree with that? Is it possible?
I don't think Finland won. I think Finland preserved its independence and sovereignty, but at a great cost of staying non-aligned, of constantly looking upon the confirmation from the Soviet side, even to the extent that some of the prime ministers of Finland did not take their position because deep state in Finland considered them to be too anti-Sovietic. So, no, I don't think Finland really won. And I would not wish such a future for Ukraine as it was there. I remember my discussion with late Zbigniew Brzezinski on this matter in Washington, D.C., a year before his death. And tactically, it might be a solution, but again, the big question is for how long this solution will stand. And considering that Finland paid with 1/3 of its territory, with most of its industrial potential at the time, and with a lot of refugees, now my question is, wouldn't it be fair to return Vyborg Viipuri to Finland? And I think this question it does also need to be put on the agenda if we speak about what victory is like, what just international order is like. So in a way, we are looking into how do we undo Yalta Conference? How do we undo the Stalin's international order and Stalin's border in Europe?
That's very important, I think, because as far as I see, there is very little kind of readiness in the West to talk about the future of Russia, the decomposition of Russia, de-imperialization of Russia. There is this fear to talk about this. Would you agree?
Absolutely. West doesn't want war at any cost. And victory without military defeat of the perpetrator in this environment seems not viable. When the West thinks that the economic measures like sanctions can deliver, they are good as one of the tools, but they mirror themselves towards Russia. They think that maybe they could be broken with the economic measures, but Russia is an animal of a different kind. Russia is a place which is ready to bear the pain and to bear the cost of the economic decline. Soviet Union wasn't too successful economically, but its military might was still sufficient to challenge the West. And yet, in the mid to long term, the Star Wars delivered and Soviet Union decayed economically, but it took a decade. Do we have a decade? Do we as Ukraine have that decade? I don't think so. For the West, it is also a matter because during the Cold War and especially during Reagan times, conventional forces of the West were quite strong. But as we can tell on, say, the German forces, they decayed a lot during those 30 more or less peaceful years in Europe.
But at the same time, do you see certain evolution? That is so-called Zeitenwende in Germany, and people started talking about Ukrainian victory. We all remember the first months of the war when the discussion was that Ukraine should probably not lose, but Russia should not lose too. Do you see this shift? Because what I think about these arms supplies, which are discussed in many ways, they are not leading to some important changes on the front line. They're not only leading to important changes on the front line, tactical, but they also kind of change the situation strategically because those partners who supply weapons can no longer say that this is not their war.
I will say a provocative thing right now. I think Ukraine was embargoed in between 2014 and 2022. So, in a very bizarre way, the victim was deterred from being able to defend its territorial integrity. So, Ukraine was somewhat informally blacklisted from being supplied advanced weapons. And even if we look into early 2022, we see that javelins and NLAWs coming were far from being artillery or tanks of what is being discussed right now. So the big question is whether our Western partners do see our victory in the same way as we see it. And how big is the inertia of that thinking that we should not really escalate? I mean, the West should not escalate, and the West should not let Ukraine escalate. So this means that the basic thing in every conflict, the escalation management capability, is given to the Russians. The nuclear deterrence capability is given to the Russians. And the West is actually not using its own deterrence capabilities. And the West has been deterring Ukraine, not Russia, in a way. And the Russia's nuclear deterrence, so the West would not be inclined to provide Ukraine, say, with the fighter jets, in a way delivered. And right now we are paying a very hard price. Now, for Ukraine to restore territorial integrity, we will need a minimum of air superiority and ground superiority. And here we speak of capabilities, and here we speak of logistics. Russia's defeat is to a big extent a defeat of Russia's logistics. Does Ukraine possess proper enough logistics in order to win over the clumsy but nevertheless really mighty enemy, which is, say, 15-fold strong in the airspace, 5 to 7 to 8 times stronger in the field? And when we speak about other statistics, is definitely David versus Goliath.
What's your response to this? Because we have seen those, changing the red lines, the so-called red lines in the West supplies. So there was no talk about long-range artillery, then it came. There was no talk about Patriot, then it came. No talk about tanks, then they came. Now there is talk about fighter jets, long-range missiles. Do you think this process is going on and the Western partners are changing these red lines a bit?
Yes, I think so. And this process is ongoing, although it is still quite slow. One of the things which is missing from the public agenda, and I do hope it is not missing from the hidden agenda, is the issue of new technologies being transferred to Ukraine. Here I speak about drone warfare, meaning the drones on water in the air, but also on the ground. And here I speak of the specific technology which changes the quality of the warfare, which is C4ICR system. This is the system of the integrated combat management, which is happening in real time, and which integrates both sensors on the fighters on the ground, the communications umbrella, harvesting of data from the combat zone in real time, and use of other integration of air, artillery, special forces capabilities into one effort. So this is fight smart. This diminishes the time of decision making. This makes a big quantitative change in the use of force. This thanks to this technology, it is possible to save many of the artillery shells because targeting becomes very precise. This is the next technological revolution in warfare. Actually, Ukraine is a laboratory for the war of the future. I am expecting artificial intellect to join this warfare very soon. I think it is already deployed, although in small quantities, and there are gossips of the Russian military AI being developed. And you know that international conventions forbid using autonomous weapons without the man in the loop. And it's a moral and legal question, but Russia is not constrained with those things. And again, we have a big question of China regarding the technology transfer and technology use and its cooperation with Russia in this regard. So I will repeat, Ukraine is a laboratory for the future of the war. And the level with which Ukraine will be able to deploy this technology will define the outcome. It's like the Brits deploying machine guns to the Anglo-Boer War in, I think it was 1903, when Boers with the rifles were simply slaughtered, and there were 600 casualties on the Boer side and 2 wounded on the British side. That's what technology does to the warfare.
When you look about the future of this war, do you draw any scenarios? What are the possible scenarios of the development in this year?
There are multiple dimensions of this war. There is political dimension, diplomatic dimension. There is purely military dimension. There is social dimension of this war. There is economic dimension of this war. And in each of those spheres, taking the most primitive scenario, making it will get better, it will stay as it is, and it will get worse, it will give you already a multitude of scenarios. To keep it much more primitive, for the situation to stay as it is, Ukraine would need a small increase of the Western aid. Say, the aid which is coming from the West right now will keep the situation as it is. It will not provide Ukraine with a decisive victory. And I don't know if it would be enough for Ukraine to break the situation and, say, attack in the dimension of Melitopol, Berdyansk, and Mariupol, and then try to destroy the Crimea Bridge, which then could be a game changer on the southern front line. With East, only the decision of the West to let Ukraine strike Russian infrastructure inside Russia, inside territories of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, will be a game changer because Russian logistics is based on the railways. Same is about Belarus. Actually, Belarus is a potentially another front line in the direction of Rivne and Khmelnytsky nuclear power plant and an attempt to cut Ukraine from Poland. Those issues are widely discussed in the security circles. In order for Ukraine to win, first, the supply of weapons to Ukraine must be increased a minimum to match the Russian capabilities. And if we speak attacking, usually military science is saying that you have to have an advantage 3-1. That's not necessarily advantage in land force. But if Ukraine wants to attack, you cannot change the military science calculus. Fighting smart might work, but still we will need to have an advantage, and I don't see it so far. So my forecast is actually until there is a major political change and major upscale of sustaining of Ukraine and helping Ukraine with indigenous production, say, of the drones. Because with a drone, and if drones are becoming cheaper, you can deliver more sometimes than with a tank. There are Ukrainian capabilities of production drones at a cost such as, say, $5,000 to $7,000 per a drone. Now the cost of Ukrainian drone is $20,000, and the cost of the Western drones of the similar capabilities offered to Ukraine is around $100,000. War is economy. Ukraine now cannot bear the cost of this war. We heavily dependent on the Western aid, and here, common vision of what Ukrainian victory is, and common strategy, meaning clear goals, clear ways, and clear means, clear money, how to do it, will be a recipe for Ukraine's victory.
Do you see any possibility that the war might become a stimulus for Ukrainian economy, for Ukrainian technology? Because you mentioned the drone production, there is much criticism inside Ukraine that Ukraine is not really paying too much attention itself into the military technologies, including drone production, the private companies which have developed the technologies but don't have the stimulus from the state. When we look at such countries as Israel, we see how the constant war, danger of war, was actually a stimulus for technological development. Is it possible in Ukraine?
It is true that wars are usually vehicle for the technology development. Say the development of space technologies were clearly driven by the Cold War. And we see that the last 30 years provided us with some breakthroughs only after Russia attacked Ukraine, and America thought that it would be not wise to depend on Russian rockets. So from one side, this development is happening. From another side, there's a huge question mark over the administrative capabilities of the Ukrainian state to firstly being able to assess possible partnership and secondly build and manage them. There was a funny, not funny situation in as early as 2014 when there was a first attempt to build some kind of Ukrainian drone. And the government started the drone program, and in 2 weeks, there was a suggestion that there will be a governmental program lasting 2 years and costing 20 million hryvnias. And then at the end, you might have a prototype. And then two commercial companies got together, and in 2 weeks, they had a prototype. So this is the gap in between the will and the capabilities of the state and the will and the capabilities of the private sector, and how to match them, it is tricky. My hope is that Vitaly Deineha, who might be appointed the Deputy Minister of Defense as of now, as a person from the civil society sector who had enough experience of dealing with Ukrainian developments, would be able to match the governmental capabilities and the Ukrainian newborn technologies, producing a scope, because war is a scope. You cannot win the war with a prototype. You have to have hundreds or thousands. Just one more example. When I studied in London, Royal Air Force made a dinner for us, for the representatives of the Royal College of Defence Studies. And there was a speech about how British military production was functioning in times of war. And during the speech, the commander of the Royal Air Force mentioned that Britain was producing 53 fighting jets per day. My friends laughed. Why? Because now it would be good for producing 53 jets a year. This is the gap between the country at war and the country in peace. And again, the West is not at war. We are at war. The quantities of the weaponry we use and we need is enormous. And matching it is also one of the points which will define whether we win or not.
Let's talk about the international context of this war. We talked about the West, but there are other countries. And we see that a lot depends on China in the way whether it supports Russia, whether it keeps neutrality, whether it keeps neutrality but hiddenly supports Russia. What do you see here?
Speaking of China, China is good at hiding its intentions, and Chinese strategic thought is good at understanding the value of alliances. If we read Sun Tzu, his advice of defeating the enemy is the very first advice is you have to defeat the alliances of the enemy. The second, you have to defeat the plans of the enemy, and then you should defeat enemy on the battlefield. In a way, as we can see it from the open source, China did not decide it yet. In my understanding, China and Russia are not friends. Russia is controlling a big chunk of lands which China considers to be historically Chinese, speaking specifically of the southeastern Russia. And Russians understand it very well. But at the same time, solidarity between the totalitarian states in the world is growing, and we can see some real successes, say the deterrence of the change of the government in Venezuela, the sustainment of the Myanmar junta, or breaking of revolution in Belarus. So clearly none of the democratic revolutions of the last 10 years, aside of Ukraine's revolution of dignity, were on the winning side. And this is a policy. This is not happening by itself. So I think China will be more and more inclined to support Russia, including with the technologies. And the last decisions of Xi Jinping to switch attention of the Chinese state from the economical development to the military development speaks of the decision that was made in Beijing. China is moving into the direction of the major conflict with the West. Whether it will be military, whether it will be proxy conflict like it was during the Cold War in Vietnam, in Korea, in Angola, in some of the Latin America, we don't know. No. And Ukraine might be one of the places of such a proxy conflict between the US and China, in a way, if China dares to fully empower Russia in this conflict.
What should the West be prepared for? Should it be preparing itself for the big war in the 21st century? Should it be preparing itself for the idea that old structures of the 20th century do not work, including all old institutions, that basically United Nations, that is much of the criticism of the United Nations. But if we say that United Nations doesn't work, that means that it collapses like the League of Nations and there is no international institution to which the countries at least, show that they adhere to. What if we are entering the period when the international institutions collapse?
Let me localize this issue a bit and then upscale it. When Russia attacked Ukraine, it didn't simply attack territory of our country. It attacked a minimum of 3 big global things that are the pillars of the international order. First one is inviolability of the borders, which is a big issue for Africa, which is a serious issue in Asia and in Latin America, where some of the borders are still not fully solidified. And if borders can be redrawn with force, then force decides it, not the international organizations. Second thing which Russia attacked is nuclear non-proliferation. Ukraine has voluntarily given up the third biggest nuclear arsenal. And right now, if Ukraine is not saved, if Ukraine is not winning, then it is only nuclear weapons that can guarantee the country at least a chance to preserve its territorial integrity. And the third thing which was attacked, and it is a bit less spoken about it, but it's extremely important, it's the international maritime law. Russia has deployed maritime blockade over Ukraine. If Russia can do it with impunity, if Russian ships still can leave the Baltic Sea, if Russian Pacific trade fleet still can do trade, it means that force is back. It means that China can block the Malacca Strait, China can block South China Sea. 90% of global trade are going via the sea. The whole Belt and Road Initiative is not about commerce. Its maximum capacity is 10% of the global trade, which is not enough. And global trade is based on the freedom of trade in high seas. If it is broken, and it is being broken right now, Persian Gulf will be closed one day. So international trade will collapse. And export-oriented economies such as US, UK, Germany, but China as well, their economies will collapse because of that. So Russia's attack on Ukraine is not a regional conflict. It is not a bilateral conflict. It is an exposure of the failure of the global institutions. And yes, UN is failing. The test, we remember that League of Nations excluded Nazi Germany and then Soviet Union because of the aggressions. It was the time when League of Nations was already failing, and it brought us into the Second World War. Now, collapse of the UN is actually again bringing us to something similar. And yes, West is getting ready. China is getting ready. US is getting ready. In a way, Russian-Ukrainian war is a great excuse for American military industry to revive itself, to bring again an industrial scope to the war, for the US to be ready for that major conflict in a couple of years. Same with China, actually. China is also not ready for a full-scope conflict as of now.
So coming back to international institutions, there is a discussion in Ukraine that international community should kick Russia out of the Security Council. And imagine if we succeed in this. And for this, we need, for example, the vote of China, the vote of so many members of the General Assembly. But imagine there is a success in this. Then we can assume that Russia quits the United Nations altogether, and United Nations collapse, because other countries can quit it as well and form kind of another alliance. So is it a good scenario, what Ukraine is trying to achieve?
I think it's still a good scenario. Membership in the UN means adhering to the norms, and the violation must be punished. Iraq paid an enormous price for attacking Kuwait. Russia did not pay the price for attacking Georgia in 2008, and none of it was there regarding Abkhazia and Transnistria. So multiple violations were impugned. The big question here is, though, what is the future of Russia? And in my understanding, Russia as of now is Soviet Union, which did not fully collapse and wants to recollect itself again. It has to collapse as the empire of which it is now. The colonies of modern Russia, such as Caucasus, but also Tuva, Tatarstan, must leave And we, the Ukrainians, must help those captive nations to regain their freedom. This is our historical mission, to end this empire. We know that some of the Ukrainians played a great role under Peter I to shape the concept of Russian Empire as it was. And it is historical responsibility for us to end this empire. And if Russia fails here militarily, the process similar to 1917 might start inside Russia. It will not be easy, it will not be good. And my worry is that in the West, chicken Kyiv thinking is prevailing. We have to preserve the Soviet Union. We have to dream of some democratic new Gorbachev in Russia, and then we will support it. Oh no, you Ukrainians, don't you dare to leave the Soviet Union. So here, an opposite thinking must there be. Democracy should reverse the course of autocracies, shaping empires, and genociding the indigenous people. Russia, in its scope, must be the last empire of the world to collapse and to become something like Latin America, a collection of 20, 30 independent states, which, like Latin America, might speak the same Spanish language, but might follow a completely different destiny. Is there a policy in the West regarding such a solution? Is there a policy to help build the regional elites, to reach out to them, to build economic ties, to see that future? I think there is a lot of fear that China will simply grab of what is left after Russia, and that might be one of the reasons why China is reluctant to help Russia at the scope. China might expect Russia to fail and then to take it. So the Ukrainian-Chinese border will be next to Kharkiv. This is also one of the scenarios, and I wonder if our Western partners want to avoid this scenario or not.
You said that there is a lack of policy with regard to de-imperialization of Russia, but that doesn't mean that it won't happen, because there was also a lack of policy in de-imperializing Soviet Union, as we know, and you mentioned Chicken Kyiv speech by George Bush, but it didn't help. And actually, why Soviet Union collapsed? Because somebody inside Soviet Union was so willing to preserve it. I mean, GKCP and this coup d'etat, which actually accelerated the collapse. So maybe we are now witnessing the same process, so we don't know. Because I do think that Russia is really living through the last stages of its imperialism. And you refer to these Ukrainian constructors of the Russian Empire. There is a joke in Ukraine that Ukrainians gave a birth to Russia, but then they will also accompany its funeral. But let me ask a provocative question as well. You hinted on it already. In the beginning of our conversation, you said that the only thing that preserves Ukraine's sustainable victory, that the war will not be repeated, and this is something that everybody is saying, that the key goal is not only the victory, but the prevention of the future war, is that Ukraine joins NATO. But there is another factor. It's coming back of Ukraine to the nuclear status. Do you think it's realistic? And what is best? Because, I mean, there are so many obstacles of Ukraine joining NATO. Maybe we should persuade our Western colleagues that Ukraine should regain its nuclear status.